Let's go ahead and get started. I want to, I'm sorry? We have a sign-in sheet here. If you could put in your name and email, it'd be appreciated. And I have a few pink slips for people who will be testifying. We'll squeeze you in when we can between this and the second testimony starting at 10 o'clock. Unless this first one runs long, and that's okay too. Then we'll take you afterwards. But first, I'd like to welcome our, yes, please come and introduce yourself. And make sure you have the red light on in order to speak.
Good morning. Good. This is awkward because I want to face everybody, but good morning, gentlemen. My name is Megan Daum. I'm with the American Beverage Association. We represent the beverage industry, refreshment beverages. So you know our biggest members are Coke, Pepsi, Keurig Dr. Pepper, Red Bull, Niagara, et cetera, et cetera. But just like to start by saying, as you know, recycling programs in our country, they differ from state to state, municipality by municipality, city by city. We have a recycling national average right now that has stagnated in the low 30%, which there's clearly room for improvement there. So what we know is that we're losing valuable materials that should be used again and again to landfills, to waterways, to nature. We don't have incentives or programs that hold consumer brands or producers responsible for the packaging choices they make when delivering products to consumers. And recycling in most places in our country is underperforming due to inefficient systems or placing onus on local governments to fix it. There's understandably great and mounting pressure from environmental groups and lawmakers to reduce waste. And many of the largest consumer brand companies have made ambitious environmental commitments, including robust recycled content and recyclability and reuse goals, including our companies. Voluntary action alone is not going to achieve the scale needed to meet these targets or achieve critical system change. We need good policy, and we need good policy that's built upon 4 key principles. They're simple. I'll get to the specifics of what EPR for packaging and printed paper entails in a moment, but I just wanted to talk kind of writ large about all policy for recycling and for consumer packaging. And those 4 pillars are: 1, strong environmental outcomes. None of us would be here if we didn't need to be here, if we didn't have recycling in the low 30% in our country. We want to have less material in nature, packaging strategically considered at the point of design, higher recycling rates, a circular economy. 2, consumer convenience. All consumers should be able to recycling something just as easily as they can throw something away. 3, financial efficiency. Money in the system stays in the system. Too often, money for recycling is reallocated. I think we can all agree that pensions and roads are really important, but when we're talking about money that's been allocated for recycling, we think it should stay there. A nonprofit running the system is really important. And there is a really important role for government, which is to set the scope of a system and provide oversight, but then letting the private sector fund and operate the system to meet specific targets. The 4th is access to material. In order to create circularity and put these valuable materials back into their next best use, and I'm talking about materials like aluminum, strong durable plastics like PET, HDPE, and polypropylene, as well as glass and paper, we need producers to be able to access those materials and at market prices. So no smoke screens here. Producers will pay for the materials at the back end, but they need to be able to access them and buy them. But we're here to talk about extended producer responsibility and for packaging and printed paper. And EPR is run successfully in countries around the world. So if you want to implement EPR, that's what I'm here to talk about. EPR is simple. How it works in practice can be really nuanced. But what EPR is, writ large, EPR is a policy that shifts responsibility for what happens to consumer packaging and printed paper at the end of its life from local governments and consequently taxpayers who pay for it to the producers who put packaging and printed paper on the marketplace. And it sets targets so that producers are funding and operating the system to achieve efficiency, but also strong environmental outcomes. Recycling today is mostly a linear system where producers make and sell products to consumers who then use and dispose of them. Municipalities are primarily responsible for collecting that stuff. And based on many different factors, including a lack of robust education, a lack of consumer access to recycling, system inefficiencies, lack of investments in collection, in separation, in processing technology, and even non existent systems, too many materials are not getting recycled and no one's held responsible. Under well designed EPR, which is really critical, this word well designed, because there's all different EPR, but under well designed EPR, the producer responsibility organization, which is made up of the consumer brands, so you have your Cokes, your Clorox, your L'Oreal, everybody, all these companies that are putting packaging on the market, whether it's recyclable or not, all of them are mandated to join a producer responsibility organization, which is a privately run, nonprofit organization. And these companies are then responsible for operating and funding the system from education to collection to processing so that they can look at the system from 30,000 feet and optimize the entire system from the front to the back end. The producers, importantly, are advised by the waste industry and the recycling community, especially the private haulers who have a very vested interest in this. And we want to make sure that their concerns are addressed because this is how they make money, as well as advised by environmental organizations, material groups, local governments, and other vested stakeholders. And please interrupt me at any moment if you want to ask questions. Okay. Fees to run the system. So you have this entire, you look at the entire system, you determine how much it's going to cost through what's called a needs assessment. So you take, for example, the state of New Hampshire and you do a needs assessment of New Hampshire and say, these are the needs of the system. This is how much it's going to cost. So you know that up front. And then the fees to run that system are assessed by different material types. So not all materials pay the same depending on how they operate in the system, the net cost to recycle. And then they are further what's called eco-modulated to incentivize environmental factors like recyclability, recycled content, et cetera. So you're paying less if you have packaging that does well in the environment, that is recyclable, that includes recycled content, and you're paying more if it does not. And like I said, this is all packaging and printed paper. It's not just what's recyclable, it's everything. And then the producer yes, sir, please. No, it's a very nerdy term. So eco-modulation is basically the idea that you have this pot of money that you need to pay for. You need to pay for the system. And so what you do is you allocate it based on different materials. So aluminum might pay a certain fee, PET, which is the plastic water bottles, HEP, your milk jugs, might pay differently, but then it's further eco-modulated. And what that means is that if I have recycled content in my cans, the average aluminum can has a 73% recycled content. That's really high. So if I'm an aluminum beverage can, I'm going to pay a lot less. And maybe in some countries like France, I'm not going to pay anything because that can is so recyclable that we've done our part, right? So the net cost is more valuable at the back end. And so that's what eco-modulation means.
And to follow up on what you said, if I may, have you noticed that this is now extended producer responsibility is very new to these shores, but it's been practiced in Europe and other places around the world. Has eco-modulation had an effect upon the producers, how they package their materials?
That's exactly the idea. Correct. The idea is that, if I'm a producer and I'm making, for example, a Twix, and I'm not calling on anybody, but I'm thinking when I visited Japan, that Twix, for example, the candy bar in our country is packaged in a multi-layer plastic, aluminum, but in Japan, it's packaged in paper. And so if the difference between those material types in the US, I'm going to pay a lot more for that multi-material because it's not recyclable every time that's going in the trash. But in Japan, it's made of paper, which is recyclable. So I would be paying less. So yes, there is a built-in incentive, and that's the entire idea, is to incentivize producers to think about packaging when they're designing it for their products. Okay. So like I said, so investments will be made throughout the system all the way from consumer education to access. And by access, I mean that every consumer will have a bin at their homes, whether single family or multifamily, to collection by the haulers, to processing, to commodity markets, to end markets back to producers. And this results in producers having greater access to more recycled materials. And that increased supply of recycled materials will, of course, allow producers to use more recycled content in their packaging, which reduces the use of virgin materials like plastic. And while this system is operated, as I said, by the private sector, government provides oversight, ensures transparency and accountability in the system. And government ultimately approves the pros plan and targets, but the producer organization is ultimately given the flexibility to meet those targets. 4 states in the country have passed EPR for printed paper and packaging, and many states have passed EPR for other things like sharps or carpets or paint, mattresses, and other things. But for packaging and printed paper, there have been 4. And those are Maine, Oregon, Colorado, and California. But even with just the 4 laws that have passed, it's abundantly clear that there are very different ways to write these laws, and consequently, we will see wildly different outcomes. For example, the law in Maine has no system change built into it, and in my opinion, will not achieve any strong environmental outcomes because it's not part of the law. And most of the bill proposals we saw in 2023, none of which passed, saw various groups attempt to use EPR as a cover for things that aren't really EPR, are really outside of the scope. And I think it's really important in this moment that we keep EPR pure and about EPR, which is about residential consumer recycling and consumer packaged goods. It's not a panacea for everything in the environmental landscape, and it shouldn't be. But when it's done well, it works. But of course, the devil is in the details. And I'm happy to answer any and all specific questions you have about EPR, but I just wanted to lay the land.
Could you speak a little bit more about your opinion on the main EPR legislation? I know it's a long process. It's and they're only the very beginning of it. Maybe you could speak to that as well about
Absolutely.
where they are and where their timeline is on that.
Yeah. So I didn't bring my cheat sheet on that, but the date the law passed was July 2021. The issues that we have, I guess I have with the main bill is first, it doesn't include printed paper. I don't know about you, but my recycling bin, if I think about my recycling bin at home, it's mostly printed paper, right? It's your mail, it's your newspapers, it's all that stuff. And so if you have a system that is focusing on residential recycling, and the idea being that we're going to pay for the whole thing, then printed paper should surely be part of that. And the argument is that, well, the paper industry thinks that their recycling rates are high enough that they shouldn't have to pay in, but the paper recycling rate in our country hovers in like the 60s, 66%, which is a lot higher than a lot of materials, certainly. But that still means that a third of paper is not being recycled, which arguably lends for work to be done. And so I think that was a real flaw in the system, because the way that happens, if you exclude printed paper, either the rest of the producers are covering the costs of the printed paper for them, or you still have taxpayers paying the printed paper portion of recycling, and that goes against the entire philosophy of EPR, which is to shift the cost away from taxpayers so they're not paying for it. And then the other piece that I have an issue with is that the EPR law set in Maine is more of what we call like an ATM model. So the producers will pay for the system, and that's it. They'll write the check, and they will have no say about kind of where the money goes or how the operation of the system works. And so the inefficiencies built into that system will stay. It pretty much preserves the status quo of that main system as it exists. And the whole purpose of EPR is that the system isn't working as well as it could, and we need to make certain changes to it, and that's not built into the law.
Follow up if I may. It sounds to me that you think the most effective EPR laws are comprehensive. And my original thinking in putting this bill in, something that was brought up in the committee, in the E&A committee, I believe, was the idea of taking it in smaller bites. Go after, say, paint, maybe perhaps, or we already have EPR for mercury in the state. But you're saying a comprehensive bill is actually would be more favorable to the industry, is what I hear you're saying. Is that correct?
For packaging and printed paper. So if you were going to have an EPR law for paint or mattresses or sharps, in my view, those things are separate. So, and absolutely you should do those things. I think that they're very successful. I'm not an expert on the mattress or paint EPR laws, but I think that they They work very well. They're very different though. I mean, you buy a mattress how often? You buy consumer packaging every day. So they're quite different. So if you're going to implement a law for consumer packaging and paper, then that's what I'm here to speak to you about.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question.
Of course.
So can you explain to me how this would affect a mattress? What, is it the packaging when you get it from the store or how they dispose of it?
My understanding, and I could be wrong to anybody watching this, like not an expert in mattresses, but my understanding is, and if anybody else in the room knows better, when you buy your mattress, you are kind of paying a advanced fee on it for what happens to it at end of life. So if it's all baked into it. So if I'm buying a mattress that has that cost baked into it, so that at the end of it, when 1-800 mattress comes in, picks my old mattress up when they deliver the new one, that is already kind of like been paid for to deal with the end of life of it. I believe that old mattresses are kind of ripped apart and made into new mattresses. I don't really like to think about that, but I think that is part of it. But again, not an expert on mattress CPR, but if somebody else is, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, yeah, may I continue? I'm very naive about this. I live in Coos County. Just down the road from my house is a recycling center. And so if I get rid of a mattress, I just bring it there, I'd throw it in the auger and they grind it up. Same thing with every day when I'm in there, I see bales of aluminum, bales of plastic, cardboard. So everything's done right there. That's surprising to me. 30% is a very low number that I didn't realize it was that low.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds to me like you have a drop off, like you put you're in the
Well,
car.
you pay like
And you pay.
like electronics, you pay a certain amount. If you have tires, you pay a certain $3 a tire. Things like that.
So that $3 probably ensures that the tire is going to the place where it needs to go to get remade into whatever happens to the tire. For the consumer packaging, I think that was what I used to do. I grew up in New Jersey. That was what I did as well. When I was a kid, we used to go, we'd load up the car, we'd go down. They had the different bays for the aluminum bay, the clear glass bay, the brown glass bay. And that is honestly a really great system because that is, you are automatically separating that stuff. But if you think about the way we've transitioned in our country, not in your community, but in most of communities, to single stream recycling, which means that at my house right now, I dump all of my stuff into one bin and it all gets mixed together. And then the truck comes and it squishes it and it squishes it. And so by the time it gets to the MRF or the material recovery facility, which is where those trucks go, not where you go, because that stuff is beautiful and clean. It doesn't need to go to a MRF. The only job of a MRF is to take single stream and separate it back out into the beautiful clean bales that you're talking about in your community. That's all that a MRF does. But what happens is that stuff is so contaminated because if you think about, some consumers aren't thinking as well, and maybe they're putting their hoses or their hangers or their Christmas lights in there because they can get away with that in a closed bin versus in a drop off you can't. And the wetness of consumer food and peanut butter and all that stuff is, so yeah, contamination is a big part of the issue in our country, and education, frankly. We need to do a much better job at educating consumers about what to put in and whatnot.
I don't want to compare this to a tax, but I would say the way it's happening in Berlin, it's more like a user fee, which I would think is very fair. But like the mattress thing you explained, when it's they already charge you before you buy it, I think that it would be not a tax, but it would affect the lower income people more than anybody, and that's where I don't.
Absolutely.
Like it.
Yeah, sure. For consumer packaging and printed paper, EPR, we do not support what's called like a consumer fee, it's called a CRF, a consumer recycling fee. We do not support that. We don't think that the cost should then be borne down to consumers. That EPR should be, the cost should be borne by the producers and not consumers or taxpayers.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more, if I
Yeah,
may.
of course.
I'm hearing a lot of good stuff here. If we are really concerned as a committee, as our charge says, of reducing municipal costs, our greatest impact will be to be look at packaging rather than such things as mattresses, tires, and paints, which are all very important. I think that's part of a comprehensive bill. But if we really want to lower the cost to consumers, if that's our main, if it were, and I'm not saying it necessarily is even, but if it were, would you say that looking at packaging is the strongest area to?
It's a strong area. I mean, because you're taking the cost of recycling, not disposal, but of recycling away from consumers. That said, I think that, one thing I'll say is that I think that you'll have pushback from the hauling community. So the private haulers, the Waste Managements, the Republics, not to call anybody out. I know this is going on a video somewhere. But we're trying to figure out how to work with those guys, because we hear them, and we hear that they have very legitimate concerns about what happens to their for-profit businesses, and they're trying to make money just like everybody else. And so we're trying to figure out how to collaborate with them in better ways so that we're not taking their autonomy away from them. But I'm putting that as like a flag for you, that I think that you'll probably hear from them.
And I thank you for these flags along the way. I'm sure they'll be very helpful.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you
truly
for having
appreciate
me.
it.
And Adam, behind me, you can always get in touch with us. We are so happy to be here, and thank you for the time.
Yes. We have a scheduled, Pe- well, Peter Blair will be speaking to us from Just Zero at 10 o'clock. He's set up to come in. In the meantime, I'm wondering if we may hear from, I don't know which one came in first, Anne or Christine. Christine Barber? And please give your name.
Good morning.
Come on in.
I'm Christine Baber from Dover. I am the co-chair of the Dover Plastic Reduction Group and a member of the New Hampshire Network Plastic Working Group, both nonpartisan citizen volunteer groups. I'm pleased that our state is actively studying extended producer responsibility in order to develop a plan for product manufacturers to share responsibility for reducing the environmental impact of their products, for reducing the waste stream going into our landfills, and saving money for residents and municipalities. I think that the previous person who spoke mentioned some of the benefits of shifting financial responsibility upstream to manufacturers. This would also provide incentives for them to reduce production of difficult to dispose of materials and to incorporate environmental considerations into the designs of their products and packaging. 6 states have EPR or similar bills covering packaging: California, Colorado, Maine, Oregon, New Jersey, and Washington. I hope we will add New Hampshire to the list. An EPR bill would have multiple benefits for New Hampshire. According to a report by the Recycling Partnership that looked at the impact of EPR programs in 7 jurisdictions worldwide and in 6 U.S. states, implementing EPR programs, and these are effective, strong EPR programs, can increase overall residential recycling rates by as much as 48 percentage points, can create nearly universal access to recycling, can increase overall participation in recycling, can boost the amount of recycled content by millions of tons, also can recapture between 13 million and 91 million in lost material economic value in EPR states. In addition, it can reduce hundreds of thousands of metric tons of climate damaging emissions in these states, and very importantly, can create thousands of jobs. We all in New Hampshire are concerned about our taxpayers and cost to municipalities. EPR will reduce costs for these groups. The Product Stewardship Institute claims that under current recycling systems, the consumer actually pays 3 times. First, for the packaging of the product that they buy, which is included in the cost of the goods. A second time for collection, recycling, or disposing of that package through municipal taxes or private subscription costs. And a third time for the indirect costs associated with post-consumer packaging, such as increased health insurance premiums resulting from higher illness and disability caused by pollution. Some who benefit from our current system of dealing with product waste allege that EPR legislation will raise costs for consumers. However, the Conservation Law Foundation asserts that there is no credible data indicating EPR would raise consumer prices. In conjunction with the Natural Resources Council of Maine, they estimated that adopting an EPR policy would save Maine's municipal taxpayers at least $16 million a year. It could reasonably be expected that similar savings could occur in New Hampshire. Because of the groups within which I'm involved, we believe that single-use plastic packaging needs to be included in extended producer bill. There is a long line of products that would benefit from extended producer responsibility, but we strongly advocate that single-use plastic be involved. U.S. plastic recycling rates, which were only about 9% in 2015, are now reported to have dropped to about 5%. And we are learning more almost every week about the health hazards as well as environmental hazards associated with plastics and the toxics that they carry. 84% of plastic waste goes to our landfills, and 11% is incinerated, releasing more toxics into the environment. We need to prohibit the use of hazardous chemicals in plastics and significantly reduce the production of single-use plastics while choosing safer, sustainable materials that could support a toxic-free circular economy. One of the really encouraging pieces of research that I have found is that voters support adopting policies such as EPR. A 2023 nationwide poll of U.S. voters found overwhelming support from both Republicans, 75% of the Republicans polled, and Democrats, 86% of the Democrats, for shifting the cost of cleaning up plastic pollution from taxpayers to the companies that make and use plastic. 90% of registered Democrats and 79% of registered Republicans were concerned about the extent of plastic found in our environment. 76% of Republicans and 89% of Democrats are concerned that less than 6% of plastics are being recycled and the rest sent to landfills, exported, incinerated, or discarded into the environment. Therefore, it's not surprising that 82% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans agree that companies should stop producing and using so much single-use plastic. An EPR would undoubtedly do that. And in conclusion to that piece, 66% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans say that taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for the cleanup of plastic waste created by companies. Luckily, we have a strong model EPR bill that exists to guide New Hampshire legislators' work. The model EPR bill, developed by Just Zero and Beyond Plastic, addresses the key requirements for effective packaging reduction, including strong oversight and accountability, providing financial relief to taxpayers and consumers, reducing toxics in packaging, and establishing environmental standards for packaging, among others. This model bill could be easily adapted to New Hampshire, and I think would address the multiple types of products that we would cover as per the earlier discussion. A strong, effective, extended producer responsibility bill offers the opportunity to reduce waste going to our burgeoning landfills, to protect the health of our environment and our residents, to increase jobs, and to reduce the economic costs of dealing with difficult to recycle plastic and other waste. I hope this committee will seize this opportunity and work to pass an EPR bill in New Hampshire. And both our Dover group and the Plastic Working Group stand ready to assist in whatever way we might. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you, please?
Thank you. I'm not sure, I don't know a lot about it, but in Northumberland, there's a pilot program where they're taking non-recyclable plastics and turning it into fuel. Do you have any information on that?
I don't know about that particular program, but there is, again, growing concern about taking plastics, incinerating them, releasing the toxics that they carry into our environment. And we know, just recently with Saint-Gobain situation, the trouble we get ourselves into in releasing toxic substances into our environment. So, our approach is go upstream, reduce the plastics, particularly single-use plastics. Mm-hmm. There are plastics that, are very important in different aspects of our our society. But a lot of the plastics that are being produced are non-essential polluting.
All right, thank you.
And thank you also for your testimony. Could we get a copy of your
Yes.
testimony? And may I also ask the prior speaker, I can give you my email address if you need it.
I have copies with
Okay.
me.
If you don't mind mailing it, if it's,
I can do both.
makes it easier to put in a record that way. So thank you. And I have no questions, but then again, I think I do have one question. And this is something which I don't expect an answer for right now. You say that our recycling rates dropped from 9 to 5% on many of these. Could you,
Plastics.
yes, could you find me your citation on that?
Absolutely.
But
It
it's
is
it's in there?
in here. Yes.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I was surprised to hear that, but not really, maybe. So,
Okay. Thank you.
we have. Yes, thank you. We have my eyes on this time. Maybe I can get it right. I'll try. Thank you. And Plodnippy? Am I close? And we have I don't want to limit your testimony. We have about 15 minutes before we have somebody else scheduled. If we tend to run over, may I interrupt and come back? Is that possible?
My name is Ann Podlipny. I am from Chester. I am also part of the New Hampshire Network Plastics Working Group. And Christine Baber did such an excellent job of representing us that I don't have very much to add at all, just a couple of little points. But I think Christine covered the ground extremely well. So the only thing I wanted to add is that according to what I've found in my research, the recycling rate for container deposit programs is 75%. If you don't have such a program, the recycling rate is only 38%. So there's an enormous difference between those those percentages. The other factoid is I've also found from the Container Recycling Institute that the 10 bottle bill states recycle 490 containers per capita per year at a cost of 1.53 cents per unit. The 40 non-bottle bill states recycle 191 containers per capita per year at a cost of 1.24 cents per unit. Thus, for a minimal price increase, more than 2.5 times as many containers are recovered. So you can see the importance of this whole initiative for EPR. And finally, no state bottle bill has ever been repealed, which is interesting, and 3 have expanded. California, Maine, and Oregon have expanded to include other containers. So that's a good fact to know that no bottle bill has ever been repealed. And in fact, it's the beginning of expanding them to other categories. So that's all I have to add. Again, I think Christine has beautifully covered the environmental hazards, the risk to human health, and the importance of reducing waste in our waste stream, especially to prevent landfill buildup and buildup of plastic waste in our oceans, rivers, streams, and other important environmental concerns.
Thank you so much for testimony and for updating us on the bottle bills, which I don't know if there'll be more to be said about that in the future or not. And I also should add, I don't know if that's really part of this particular legislation. I really can't say. But thank you for picking it up. They're good. That is very good information. And again, could we get a copy of your just email if you don't mind?
I will.
Thank
Thank you.
You're going to recess for about 10 minutes there while we get ready for our next person to testify. Thank you. Speaking for the committee, if anybody would care, this is probably a little unusual, but if anybody would care to come sit on this side of the table, so you may watch as well, you are welcome to do so, instead of watching the back of a screen. And good morning, Peter. I don't know if you can hear me or not. Are we?
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. We'll get started in this about 1 minute here.
Okay. PowerPoint presentation would be okay if I share my screen.
Yes, I think we're looking forward to that, in fact. So,
Are you able to see the PowerPoint?
yes, we are. And I think we're all ready to get started whenever you would like to get started. Thank you.
Okay. Terrific. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me and accommodating my virtual presence. My name is Peter Blair. I'm an environmental attorney and the policy director for Just Zero. For those of you that are unfamiliar with us, Just Zero is a new environmental advocacy organization. We work with policymakers, experts, communities to implement just, equitable, and sensible solutions to waste management issues. A key component of my job is understanding the legislative landscape when it comes to policies and proposals that solve waste management issues. And as you can imagine, for the last years, this has increasingly meant understanding producer responsibility for packaging and paper material, or EPR for packaging. I think the last 3 to 4 years, this has become probably the most widely discussed zero waste policy in the country. So where are we? Right now, there are 4 EPR laws in the U.S. Maine went first, followed quickly by Oregon, then Colorado, and California. This year, we did not have any new EPR for packaging programs passed. Instead, Illinois and Maryland passed similar bills that are essentially creating the groundwork for them to look at a proposal in the coming years, similar to what you guys have done with your study commission, but they're actually doing a comprehensive needs assessment to figure out the landscape and design a program that's tailored for their state. Look at just the laws that have passed. That doesn't tell you the full picture. So in 2023, there were 18 different EPR for packaging bills introduced across 12 states. And the interest in this policy really is not that surprising. We have a packaging waste crisis in this country. Roughly a third of all household waste is some form of packaging. So think plastic wrap, cardboard boxes, styrofoam, bubble wrap, all of that. And right now, we're buying things, but we don't really want the packaging, but we're stuck paying for the packaging anyway because it just comes with the products we're buying. I think we've all had the experience where you buy something probably online, only to end up with a small product next to a huge pile of waste you're now stuck trying to manage. Ultimately, most of this is unrecyclable plastic that can't be put anywhere except into a landfill, into an incinerator, or littered throughout our communities. 3 options that are expensive and environmentally problematic. And without new laws, this just is not going to change. Right now, the companies that design their products really have no incentive to change this system because we're the ones stuck paying to collect and manage all of this material. In fact, these companies have an incentive to just make sure that they're packaging their products as cheaply as possible since they're not connected to the end-of-life management of it. But this really doesn't make sense because local governments, consumers, we don't have control over how these products are being designed or the materials they're using to package their products. So it's really this chicken and egg game where they create a new type of packaging, some new type of plastic, and we're stuck trying to design systems that can manage it. This is not working. So EPR for packaging is designed to address this by first and foremost taking that financial incentive to pay for the cost of collecting, managing, transporting all of this packaging waste and disposing it and recycling it from residents, from taxpayers, from communities, and put it back on the companies that have control over these products. When properly developed, these programs can significantly increase recycling rates create a pathway towards a circular economy, and most importantly, reduce waste. In general, here's how these programs work. Each company that sells or distributes products using any type of single-use packaging has to be a part of a producer responsibility organization, has to be a part of the program. The program is going to be overseen by the state, but implemented by that PRO, that producer responsibility organization. And each individual producer is going to pay fees that cover the whole cost of the system. Some of that money is going to go towards reimbursing local governments for the cost of managing the waste. And the rest of it is going to go towards system improvements, making sure our recycling system's working, making sure that everything is moving to the end goals, the end markets that we want it to. That's traditional EPR. We've seen a new interest in also making sure that these systems are well designed and that there's pressure on producers to change the way that they're designing and marketing their products through performance standards. Now, all of this sounds really simple, right? But obviously it's very nuanced when you're trying to actually implement one of these programs. So what Just Zero has done is two things. First, we've created model legislation to help states implement programs for their jurisdictions. It's model legislation, so there's a lot of boilerplate language that we think could be applied to all programs, but really it can be tailored by legislators to meet your state-specific needs. But we've also created a list of essential components for a successful EPR for packaging program, and both the model legislation and our essential components were created by looking at the existing programs across the world, the laws that have been passed here in the US, and the bills that are being considered to really understand how these programs, how these are trying to address the really thorny, complex issues when it comes to setting up a very big, overarching program like EPR for packaging. So I'm just going to run through what those essential components are. And also, if you have any questions at any point, just stop me.
I'd like to stop you for a moment if I may.
Yes.
Is there any way you can make your PowerPoint full screen? I think, at least I'm having trouble seeing some of it.
Okay, it was full screen for me. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to stop sharing and try to reshare it. Despite my youthful look, I am not as good with technology as you would think. Okay. Is it full screen now?
I think it's much better. Yeah, it does. I think that is full
Sorry.
screen at this point.
Sorry, I had a little trouble hearing you there.
Oh, yes. Short answer, yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So, okay, the essential components for a strong EPR packaging program. The first, be holistic. Make sure the program covers all packaging material, all papers possible with minimal exemptions. And you want to make sure you're covering the whole range of producers of this packaging material with some exemptions for small businesses. Data-driven, you want to make sure that the program is reflecting the needs of your specific states. So you do that with a comprehensive needs assessment at the beginning. Second, don't put the industry in charge. Regulated producers should have a role in the development of the program. It is producer responsibility after all. But that role really should not be in setting the core values of the program. Things like setting the fees, determining the performance standards, those types of things. Those are better left with the state. Next, create a strong, transparent fee system. The money created from the program is a really big component of this. So you want to make sure that it is covering the whole cost of the program and that the fees are actually being used to incentivize good behavior by the companies. Next, with all of that money, you also want to make sure it's going towards the objectives of the law. So reimbursing towns and cities for their recycling and disposal costs and funding new infrastructure to make sure the system's working even better. Next, you want to make sure you have clear, enforceable, strong performance standards. The fees alone, even with eco-modulation, which I'll get into in a little bit, just aren't going to give you widespread benefits that can come from this type of program. You really want to set environmental performance standards as part of the program that producers have to meet. Avoiding glaring loopholes. This is a new type of policy. There's a lot of nuance to it. So there's a lot of ways that you can insert language that to undermine the effectiveness of the program. So you want to make sure that that's not included. And then finally, you can say this about any type of law, but you really strong oversight, accountability, and enforcement. A good law on paper really is nothing if it's not going to be enforced. So, okay, be holistic. Let's try to cover as much packaging and paper as we can. So first and foremost, what does that mean? It means covering primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging. Most EPR for packaging programs only focus on primary packaging, and that's the packaging that we get when we go and buy a product. But there's a lot of back-end packaging that gets associated from the development of the product, shipping it to the distributors, and ultimately to retailers. So you want to make sure that's covered. There are some exemptions, things that shouldn't be covered under this program. Reusable and refillable packaging, that's where we want the direction to go. We want to get away from single use, from that linear create, use, dispose of system. So if you have reusable, refillable packaging, that shouldn't be covered to incentivize companies to switch to that. Containers, paint, other packaging that are better covered by a more targeted program, those should be excluded and covered by their own producer responsibility program. And then certain packaging that's covered by federal law and regulation, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, those things, you'll run into preemption issues sometimes. So you need to be careful about making sure that you exempt those so you don't run into any legal issues there. So just quickly, I mentioned this, but when it comes to figuring out what those targeted specific types of packaging that are better managed by other programs, the biggest one is a bottle bill. There's been a renewed interest in bottle bills while there's been this uptick in EPR for packaging interest, and it makes sense. Both of them are packaging widely littered products, things that are just not being recycled as possible. Really, the question shouldn't be, do you include bottle bills in EPR for packaging? It should be how to create a complementary bottle bill system. And there's 3 reasons you really want a separate bottle bill program. The first is when you include beverage containers in EPR for packaging, you're losing the litter reduction benefits that are core to bottle bills. So when you have a bottle bill program and you place that refundable deposit on every single-use beverage container sold in the state, that creates an incentive for people to hold on to their empty cans and bottles, bring them back for recycling, and make sure that they're properly managed. That's really important because beverage containers are generally consumed on the go, right? Have them in your car, you have them when you're leaving the house. There's a reason we see Coke bottles, beer bottles, all these things littered across our neighborhoods, but you're not seeing cereal boxes or peanut butter. It's because beverage containers are different from most packaging. They're consumed on the go. So if you want that litter reduction, you need a bottle bill. Second, recycling. Beverage containers are made of materials that are highly recyclable if they're actually kept clean and uncontaminated. So when you create a bottle bill program, you're creating a standalone system that is just managing those containers. You're guaranteeing that you have a clean stream of high quality recycled content that can be repurposed into new things. If you have them in an EPR for packaging system, they're going to stay in that single stream. They're going to stay in the curbside recycling system, and you're just not going to get the same benefits. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, is you lose the reuse and refill value if you don't have a bottle bill. So bottle bills create the consumer culture as well as the systems needed to transition from single-use beverage containers to reusable and refillable ones. Oregon has already done this. They've had their bottle bill program for, I think they're the second longest, so it's been since about the 70s. And recently they've started to integrate reusable beverage containers into their programs. And for the consumer, nothing's changed. They still go and drop off the containers at their redemption center, points of drop off. But instead of having the bottles crushed up and recycled, they're cleaned, sterilized, and reused, which has significant environmental benefit. So, okay, that's what's regulated. Now the big question is who's regulated? Who is the producer under the system? Generally, it's anyone who offers for sale or distributes products using single-use packaging in the state. But what's really important is that you use a tiered approach to define producer with the goal of targeting the largest possible company who could be considered the producer of the product of the packaging itself. That way, you're not going after just a small in-state business that is selling it on behalf of a bigger company, right? The idea is to get changes in the design of the packaging. So you want to make sure you're regulating the company that has control over how the product is being designed. And you should have some exemptions for small businesses. Generally, when you look at the laws that have passed, these exemptions are kind of twofold. The first is you pick a certain amount of gross annual income. And if a company makes under that, they're exempted from the program. And the second is if they're using a relatively small amount of packaging material to sell and distribute their products. This typically ranges anywhere from 1 ton to 5 ton. Okay, so that's the first one. Next is a data-driven program using a comprehensive needs assessment to figure out what the specifics of your state are so you can have a really tailored program. So when it comes to waste management and especially packaging waste, we really have a limited amount of data. We don't know how much packaging waste the state is dealing with, how much of it's recycled, how much of it's being disposed of, what types of materials are actually recyclable in your jurisdiction. All of this information is really necessary to having a strong program. So what you want to do at the outset is require this needs assessment to figure out where things stand now, how do we get them to a better place, and what are the opportunities for targeted investments, and how much does it actually cost to manage all this material in the first place. And you can do this either as part of a comprehensive bill, or you can pass a standalone needs assessment bill, which is what Maryland and Illinois did this year. So next, and this is a very big component of it, is figuring out the right balance between the state and the producer responsibility organization, the PRO, the nonprofit entity that's going to kind of run the system on behalf of the producers. So producer responsibility does not mean unregulated producer control over the program. In reality, it means the opposite. The laws and regulations that are designed for the program are going to be implemented. They're going to set clear, understandable, and enforceable standards, which the producers must meet. And then the producer responsibility organization, we recommend there's only one. So all the producers are under this umbrella, are going to be responsible for complying with the components of the law. To ensure the proper breakdown of this power, there's two things you can do. And actually Maine's program did both of these really well, in my opinion. The first is have in the law a clear breakdown of what the responsibilities for the PRO is and what the state is. And the second is to not let the producers themselves just create the producer responsibility organization, but have the state select one through a comprehensive bidding process. So first, figuring out who should be in charge of what. The state should be in charge of the really big picture things like setting the performance standards, setting the fees, determining the fee structures, and ultimately determining what type of packaging is readily recyclable in your jurisdiction. On the other hand, the producer responsibility organization should act more as a data and compliance aggregator. They should be responsible for collecting the fees from participating producers, making sure that all the compliance data is being sent in an understandable format to the department, and making sure that the producers are meeting the requirements under the law. And again, to help with this, that competitive solicitation process that Maine's doing should really help. They're going to issue an RFP, and then people are going to bid to be that independent system operator. Okay, the fees are obviously a very big part of producer responsibility. You want to make sure that the fees are designed in a clear and transparent way. So one of the most important things is to make sure that you're covering the whole cost associated with the program. So what does that include? The actual cost of collecting, transporting, managing, dealing with all the covered packaging material, that should be included in the fees. Next, you want to make sure that the department's environmental, administrative enforcement, all of their work to keep this program afloat is being covered so that you don't need taxpayer funding to keep this thing going. The PRO's administration of the program, kind of that breakdown I just talked about, they are going to have a role. That should be covered by the program as well. And then also things like the cost of promulgating the rules, paying for the needs assessment, you want all of that baked into the overarching fee. So this is really a closed loop that the fees the producers are paying cover the entire system. You don't need outside funding. You're not going to run into budget issues. So that's the large fees in general, how you figure out the big pot, what the whole system's going to cost. Next, making sure that the individual producer payments are designed in a way to seek environmental benefits. So each individual producer is going to pay a portion of that big number, the fee, based on the amount of packaging material that they use and the type of packaging material that they use. And each type of material is probably going to have a different fee. So things like paper and cardboard that are highly recyclable, that have good recycling rates, those are going to probably have a lower fee than something like single-use plastic film, which really can only be burned or buried. So that's how you're going to get a base fee, but then that base fee should be further changed and eco-modulated. And this is just adjusting it to incentivize good behavior. So if the specific type of packaging you're talking about is recyclable, if it doesn't have toxic materials in it, if it has a certain portion of recycled content, all things we want to see, that producer's fee should drop. And conversely, those who aren't doing those things are using unrecyclable materials, who haven't incorporated recycled content, who haven't phased out toxic materials, their fees will increase. It's a kind of market for the results we want to see: packaging reduction and redesign. Next, make sure that the money is actually funding the solutions. So there's going to be different ways that the money is used for the program. The first kind of bucket is covering the cost of the program. I talked about this already. Make sure that a good chunk of the money is just keeping the system running and taking care of the whole system's cost of administration. But the second is more about funding improvements to recycling and packaging management. You want to make sure that there's investments that are going to help reduce packaging waste and improve recycling. And you do this in two ways. First is by those reimbursement payments to cover local government's cost of managing packaging waste. This will significantly reduce their tax burdens. It will shift that financial component of understanding of managed packaging waste from communities back to the producers. And next is you don't just want to fund the system that we have currently, because it's unfortunately not working. So you want to make sure that there's funds for system improvements. And you do that through targeted grants that are going to improve the waste management system. So we recommend doing that through a packaging reduction and recycling grant program. So a portion of the money will go into this fund. The producer responsibility organization is going to be responsible for reviewing grant applications and making recommendations to the state environmental agency, here the Department of Environmental Services, about what should be funded. The grants need to be focused on eliminating single-use packaging, increasing the transition of single-use packaging to reusable and refillable packaging, increasing the recyclability of single-use packaging, investments in reuse and refill infrastructure, which are going to be necessary, and providing education and outreach so everyone knows the proper waste management methods for each type of material. So a lot of that is just fee-based, right? What I've talked about at this point, but unfortunately, that's not really going to do a good enough job to get the kind of widespread changes that we want. Just creating a system that shifts the paying and packaging waste from individuals, local governments to the producers just is not going to work. In fact, as a result of kind of exclusively focusing on this fee shifting mechanisms, existing producer responsibility laws really haven't achieved the significant packaging waste reduction or packaging redesign that we want to see. And that's because a lot of the money is continuing to flow downstream towards collection, disposal, and recycling. So even when the programs attempt to kind of get around this through eco-modulation, what I talked about before, incentivizing good behavior, punishing bad, it's really just not a strong enough economic trigger to have serious change. So what you want to do with effective modern producer responsibility programs is set clear environmental standards that focus on package production and recycling. We're talking about rates and dates, setting specific targets for when a certain amount of packaging waste has to be reduced and how much packaging needs to be recycled. This is starting to happen, especially in the US. California currently has packaging reduction requirements in their law. They only apply to plastic packaging, but it's a good start. Oregon's program has very specific recycling requirements for both plastic packaging and single-use food serviceware. They're requiring that all of that material be recycled at a rate of 25% by 2028, 50% by 2040, and then 70% by 2050. Maine's law did not actually set any of these performance standards in statute, but they're being figured out through the rulemaking process, which is happening right now. Next, avoid glaring loopholes. Again, this is a new type of program. It's innovative, which that invites a whole bunch of nonsense and ways that users can minimize the effectiveness of the program. And this is really important because these programs take a while to get off the ground. For instance, Maine passed their law in July of 2021. They're still in the process of developing the draft rules. We're talking probably 2 to 3 more years before their program's fully implemented. So if you have any loopholes or inefficiencies in your program in the law, it's going to take a while before the program is even up and running for you to realize them. So the 2 biggest ones we're seeing is inviting false solutions. So weak definitions of recycling that allow for things like advanced recycling or chemical recycling. This could be its own topic. So I'm not going to go into all of it. I will just say there is a significant amount of data that shows that advanced recycling or chemical recycling does not actually result in the meaningful recycling of plastic material. And another common thing we're seeing is just very large and vague exemptions. California's law has a really good example of this. They're going to exempt any single-use packaging material that presents a unique challenge in terms of compliance with the law. As an attorney, that's just a gold mine. No one knows what that's going to mean. You can litigate that for years to come, and it's going to result in a lot of material being excluded, which doesn't mean it's not there. It just means being paid for by the system. And then finally, strong oversight and accountability and enforcement. You can say this with any type of law, but you really want to make sure what you write on paper is going to have a real world impact. So enforcement, make sure the state environmental agency has adequate enforcement measures in the law to bring actions against individual producers and the PRO. Oversight, you want periodic audits of the program to track how much money is being brought in. Is that money being spent in accordance with the requirements of the law? And are producers complying with the environmental standards that are set? And then finally, accountability. You want to make sure that all of this is publicly transparent, that people can weigh in on the system, and that they understand it. I know that was a lot, probably very quickly, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'd like to start with one. One of the keys that seems to have an effective program is making sure that we have adequate, what I would assume would be consumer sorting of these various products. Keeping bio waste, compostable things out of the waste flow. Making sure that things are separated properly. And this would probably require some amount of education to the consumer. You had quite a list of what could be done beyond just the fees themselves being levied back. Is consumer education as part of that? Did I miss that?
Consumer education is a big part of it, and that's a role we think is better served by the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, than necessarily the state. They're the ones who are manufacturing the products. They're going to have this kind of umbrella of the producers that understand their products and the packaging associated with it. We see a big role that they're going to play is creating that uniform list of educational materials that explain what is recyclable, what can actually be recycled in, let's say, New Hampshire, what currently isn't, how they should be managed, those types of things. And education is a big part of these programs, especially in Europe, where they've been in place since the 1990s.
Thank you. I think we will get a copy of that PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yes, I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint, and I didn't necessarily have a written testimony, but I had bullet points, which I'm also happy to share.
Sure, that both would be very helpful. I think I'll save the rest of my questions for offline, if that's okay. I need to do a little processing on this, but I want to thank you for your testimony.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question. I know in the process of making plastic, thousands of chemicals are being used. None of them, or very few of them, are ever regulated or restricted. When you downcycle plastic, what incentive is there in this process of repackaging and these EPR laws to reduce the number of chemicals in plastic when it's being recycled? Because when it gets recycled, it's coming back to us, even though it's downgraded, we're still getting them. And what is the incentive for these industries to reduce the number of chemicals being used and exposing what they truly are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Currently, right now, no incentive, right? They're completely detached from the end-of-life management of this. If they include toxics in their bill, and if those toxics, thus, when we're using the products, when they're being recycled, it's not their problem. Through EPR, there's kind of two ways you can do it. The first is that eco-modulation, so making sure that the fees are tailored to those environmental outcomes. And most of the programs that are coming up in the US, they have eco-modulation for toxics. So if you reduce the amount of toxics that are present in your packaging, your fee goes down. If you still have harmful toxics in the packaging, fee goes up. So that's one way, and that can be very helpful. The other way is with those performance standards I was talking about, calling out specific types of toxics and just phasing them out and requiring that all of the producers regulated under this program must phase out X toxics. In our bill, we've done that by an initial list of the common problematic toxics in plastic and consumer good packaging as a starting point, and then allowing the state environmental agency to periodically review additional toxic materials and determine if they should be included in the program and included in that phase out. So it is a big problem, and you can't really have anything that's recyclable if it has toxics in it, because even if they're present in the initial packaging when you create it, heating them up, going through the recycling process, it really does increase the likelihood that they're going to leach out.
One more question from our representative, Sherry Dutsey.
Hi, Peter. Representative Sherry Dutsey here. How you doing? I had a question about the echo modulation and how is that regulated? Would we as a state have to set up maybe a laboratory that, you know, if the packaging has been changed, then the producer just submits the new packaging for testing so that we know that the formula has been changed and it's an improved formulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my understanding is that you can either do it through the legislation or through rulemaking process, but ultimately you'd want the state to come up with the entire fee structure. And Maine is going through this process right now with their rules. So you're going to figure out a laundry list of packaging in general. You're going to assign a fee to each type of packaging. So plastics 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 7, cardboard, paper, glass, steel, aluminum. And then you're going to figure out in the legislation or in the rulemaking process how you want to eco-modulate it. What is going to be given kind of pluses and minuses. And then the producers are going to pay individual fees based on their packaging portfolio. And they're going to have to submit, reports to the PRO to show kind of where they are. Okay, with this specific type of packaging, it's got a 50% post-consumer recycled content. That's why our fees should be this. And the PRO is responsible for collecting the fees and doing everything with the money, but the state sets the requirements. And then those audits I talked about in the enforcement section, that's how you make sure everything's, working as properly as it should be, and that there's no funny business going on in the back end.
Seeing no
The fees
further.
are one of those things that sound a lot more complicated than you think, but I'd encourage you to look at Maine's process where they're figuring it out through rules, and it is complicated, but we've got a lot of very complicated environmental programs in this country, so there's a way to do it.
Thank you again, Peter. And I don't think we have any more questions for you. And I want to thank you for the excellent questions in addition to what you presented. Hope to talk to you soon.
All right, thank you very much.
And I'm thinking for our next meeting, I would really like to consult with our 2 absent members before we reschedule. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Beyond that, I believe our business here is concluded for today. I'm not going to ask for a motion to adjourn.